drawn up these proposed objectives for our 4 weeks together. Explore the personal, intellectual, spiritual, and social themes in the book. That's pretty broad. Examine how these themes inform our views of ourselves, the groups to which we belong, our society, and our common future. I put that in there because I've read half the book so far. It's kind of making me look at people differently. And look at others differently, and even, the different groups I'm a part of, and even our society and social policies. So maybe it will have that impact on others. Consider how these themes speak to our spiritual lives. I think that this is an area of exploration for us. And always to build community, which is important. Our values and expectations for our time together is to do our best to read the pages, to explore the text appreciatively and critically. I always think it's good to have both of those hats on at the same time, to try to understand what an author's getting across, and to be on their side as far as we can, at least in terms of understanding what point of view they have. But it's also okay to look at any text critically, which doesn't mean that you don't like it, but just to bring your thinking, your experience, your ability to be independent in your judgment of a text. To give each person the opportunity to share if they wish, but also to extend a compassionate heart, ear, and mind to each participant. To attempt to build community that is safe to express all comments and feelings, including those that require vulnerability. It's good to build that sense of trust and risk-taking in a small church group. We can do that. But to realize too that nobody's an expert, we're all learners, and that we've come together to help each other learn. How's that for values and expectations?
Good.
Our syllabus is here for our 4 weeks. There's roughly there are 400 pages in the book. So I've assigned basically 100 pages per week. You can read ahead, that's always okay, of course. So I did a quick review of the first 112 or so pages and made some notes, but I'd like to start with all of you. What are your general impressions so far?
I've enjoyed reading this book. And I love the way he talks about the history of how civilization developed and the pros and cons of them.
Yeah, so we'll talk about that chapter 5. I found that chapter 5 to be the most challenging just for my brain.
I was going to say new ideas for me. Certainly this idea of that civilization with the ownership of personal property, after, we had all of these years of being hunter-foragers and kind of able to live a relaxed life, then civilization is what brings, at least until 11:45 p.m., brings a lot of heartache. So I thought that was interesting. I mean, more than interesting, very challenging.
Yep. So that's Jacques Rousseau's perspective that that the author here, Bregman, develops. Mm-hmm. Any other general assessments so far, no matter how far you are into the book? Are you finding it readable, challenging? Are you insulted, inspired?
I agree.
I just started the book, and I find it very readable, easy to read, and it really brings me in.
Right. Absolutely.
I was going to say that same thing, Diane. I agree with you. And I think what is thought-provoking about it is the combination of the discussion of the social issues of today interwoven with the science or the anthropology, and sort of breaking that down and seeing it as it was known at different times in our society. Because I think that's an important part of both this and thinking about why humans act the way they do, and sort of the issues of racism that we're kind of grappling with, is you look at different times, different people felt, or what was considered to be the most salient knowledge changed, and yet people still walk around with those beliefs. And if you're sort of unwilling to hold the two in context, or in dialectic in
Dialectic, yeah.
yeah, then like these two views that he's talking about between Hobbes and Rousseau, you know, it's hard. And I think the author does a good job at that.
And I had never thought about the fact that he tells us that for most of civilization, there have been slaves. And that really basically until the 1800s, that was the case. So that really affected all kinds of aspects of civilization.
Do you find his writing style to be a little flippant or bordering on a little silly?
Sometimes.
Or is that just a good way to keep us engaged and smiling a little bit as we go along?
I think so. And he comes back to what he's flipped about as he goes through. But you sort of, where'd that come from? And then where did that go? And then he comes back to it.
Yeah, I find that for maybe a less disciplined reader who says, I'm going to read this regardless, to me, it's a device to keep pulling you back in a little bit to think about the deeper things.
Well, I think it's very well researched, but he seems to be writing for a general audience, not a academic audience.
Yeah.
Which is always what you have to do if you really have an idea you want to get out there. You can't just preach to the ivory towers or to your own profession. And I think this is a book that could be read by any general reader who also appreciates ideas. Later in the book, he admits that he's had a complete change of mind about this. And in a previous book, something like The History of Progress that he wrote, he kind of bought into the veneer theory because everybody bought into the veneer theory. So this book is kind of a reverse course for him. And I appreciated that vulnerability on his part to admit that he's been an adult learner on this topic as well.
Very interesting. Has anybody read the book? I read it in college, so it was decades ago. The Structure of Scientific Revolutions?
No.
What you just said about him reminds me a little bit about that. And I respect the fact that he's kept an open mind and allowed himself to change his perspective based on what he's learning. And the whole thing about Structure of Scientific Revolutions is basically what the title says, is that over time, hundreds of years, thousands of years, human beings have come to understand, the natural world and each other differently as more information came to be apparent or be learned by people, and how previous theories were discarded and replaced by new theories. So when you finish reading the book, you realize, well, what we know today, some of it is going to change. What we believe today will continue to change as we know more.
Which is difficult because I think people generally dislike ambiguity. So
Right.
prefer for matters to be settled.
Especially someone who's starting college and you think you're there to learn facts, but you're really there just to learn how to learn.
Oh, very well stated, Diane. Very true.
What you said is very consistent with, Rutgerman's book as well.
Well, I made a list of things to talk about, but I'd like you to address things that you found compelling, confounding, inspiring. Any
Why
past?
don't we hear your list so we can react to it?
It's a long list, but
Yeah, I have a long list. But, well, one of the things that struck me, which is kind of early in Diane, and maybe, so you probably can talk about this, is the idea of our news today as a mental health hazard of, the sensationalism takes us to a negativity bias because there's, what is available, what sells papers, sort of brings us into that mindset. And so then we tend to look at what's going on around us in a negative way and make inferences from that. I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, actually, that's just as far as I got. And I appreciated that a lot as a reminder to myself. I tend to not follow, except for now because they're bigger themes, but I tend myself not to follow daily news or real local news.
Mhm.
I'd rather read articles that are more about recent trends. Anyway, yeah, that's a good reminder. Being fed on the news constantly is a real downer.
Mhm. But
It
just
is
the idea too, that even the scientists are influenced by that. So people who are writing about the trends or the issues can also get caught in that web, kind of to what you said earlier, Jeffrey, that he calls himself on that. He's introspective enough to say, okay, we have to guard against our own biases as the researchers in talking about these things.
You know, this reminds me, I've seen a lot of spiritual teachers and pastors say in the last couple months, you know, speaking pastorally, limit the amount of time you watch the news these days because it can really overwhelm your spirit and paralyze your actions, your good actions.
Mhm.
I saw this from Richard Rohr recently, from Susan Thistlethwaite, who was for a long time the president of Chicago Theological Seminary, one or two other places. And I think it's really worthwhile considering. Do you remember the old phrase, if it bleeds, it leads? Describe local news.
Mhm.
You know, it's still true today. The first story on a local TV news is always an accident or a shooting.
Yeah.
And a steady, you know, some of that information is important. It's important to know if there's a natural disaster going on or whatever, but a constant diet of it, who knows what that does to wear down our spirits over years. And I'm a news junkie, so maybe I don't know, maybe I'm the exception that proves the rule that you can be a happy person and watch the news, because I think I'm a happy person. But I think by the third time I've heard a story on you know, the different national media, I think that's probably 2 times too many.
Mhm. Mhm.
And I can just turn it off and probably have a better outlook.
I think a lot of
You
people
meditate, don't you?
news.
I do
Sorry,
meditate.
Julia, go ahead.
I do.
Mhm.
Junior, where's?
No, I just think a lot of people are feeling really like quite depressed by watching the news too much. And it's very healthy to turn it off.
Mhm.
Not completely.
And if another phrase I learned a long time ago is modeling the news. If you watch a TV news anchor, they'll look so serious and sad when they're telling you a very serious and sad story. But then there was a puppy that got adopted this week, but you know, and they're trying to sell you the emotion behind the news, because they know that that's how you get hooked to continue watching it after the next commercial and to watch it the next day. Is they know how vulnerable we are to the emotional tug, whether that's sadness, terror, or look at the cute puppy. And we're just being manipulated by the media.
And the cute
Where
puppy
even-
usually comes at the end too.
Yes, the feel-good story is always the news story at the 3 minutes before the end of the broadcast
Mhm.
on the national broadcast news. But NPR and PBS do this too. I've noticed if you
Less.
listen to their little snippets of descriptions of things, they'll find just the right few words to make things sound just as grave and really apocalyptic as possible.
Mhm.
And we all watch it.
I'm also reading the Thinking Fast and Slow book. Read
Do I
that.
know? I think I know that book. What's that book about?
It's by Daniel Kahneman, and it's about our mind sort of as 2 processors. You have like system 1 thinking and system 2 thinking. you could think of it as maybe frontal lobe or, your long-term memory and your short-term memory, but that most people go throughout the day thinking in their system one, which doesn't like discourse, which does a lot of things by intuition and doesn't go to what is difficult or what makes the mind uncomfortable, which is the systems two thinking. And I think a lot of the news, you process it in a way that you're not getting into that more distinct system two thinking. And when in this book, I think it gets into, it comes out in the news, but it also came out when he was talking about, the Lord of the Flies, the reality TV and how we make meaning. So a lot of Kahneman's work is about how we make meaning of things. And if you aren't really thinking it through, you're sort of making meaning at the surface using your own mental models rather than going to different things. And that's why we sort of take the Lord of the Flies as fact. In the real world or these reality TV shows, that's how all life is, because that's what we see.
I love the story of the rescue by Captain Warner, because I was thinking of the Lord of the Flies. And then he has the antidote for the Lord of the Flies. And what a delightful story that is. And we know that those boys had some spiritual background. They were studying, their prep school was St. Andrews. So they were at a Christian school, and they used Christian rituals to help themselves survive on that island. Particularly, they closed their day with a song, and I think it said a prayer as well. Yes, a prayer as well. They also had a way of, just thinking of some of Paul's letters, they also had a way of resolving conflicts that allowed them to continue to work together through that 15 months that they were on that island. So I thought that was just such an amazing and wonderful story. And I've always hated Lord of the Flies. So I am so glad that there's an antidote for it.
You're happy to have that debunked.
I am.
And actually that came up again later. Now that you're saying that, Nancy, this idea of sending them off to cool off in some of the tribal studies that he talks about later, the nomadic people, when tensions got a little high, they would like send the people in opposite directions to go cool down. And I think the boys even did that. They would send somebody off to think about what they've done.
My daughter and I were talking about this, and our daughter spent some time at a live-in treatment. It was kind of like a camp. And she said that one of the techniques was, in addition to having people separate, to then when they came back together, there was a third person, a member of one of the other girls in the therapy group, who could intervene as these two who had a conflict came back together and help each of the girls think more deeply about whatever the conflict was. So at the therapeutic center, there was also just kind of a little bit of training in how do you approach conflict, and how do you help people who are in conflict.
That was sort of what we were talking about in the past two spiritual enrichments.
Absolutely.
What
Can
else?
we talk about the puppies or the fox?
Yeah.
I like that because it really talks about evolution. And, but it just sort of step by step by step. It's really, I thought that was really interesting, the way that they had sort of bred those foxes to wag their tails and be friendly.
Mm-hmm.
I had heard that story somewhere. At night I listened to the BBC, and the BBC radio has these stories that just you never hear in this country. I had heard about the Tongan boys on Ata, I heard that in an hour-long BBC documentary, like in the last year. And then likewise, the breeding of these foxes, I had heard that story also on the BBC. And the emphasis of the story on BBC about that was that like half the foxes turned out to be like dogs, but half of them turned out to be the most vicious versions of foxes. Because again, you breed half of them, to be, you take the most friendly to breed each other, but then you leave the others who are not so friendly to breed. And basically you had mean foxes versus the friendly foxes in the same compound. Of course, they were kept separate.
Mm.
But the point that Bregman makes is that do I understand right? Is that human beings have essentially been bred to be friendly. And that's friendliness is our superpower.
Yeah, yeah.
And social learning, the ability to learn from each other and take our cues of what kind of behavior is appropriate and what's not appropriate, that this is distinctively human and that we continue to be bred that way or have been bred that way anyway.
And he talks about Neanderthals versus human, Homo sapiens.
Mhm.
And where Neanderthals had the bigger brain, we're more the copycats. And just as you said, we learn from others. We learn from being together and so forth. I thought that was fascinating. Plus the thing about the eyebrows.
I wrote a note today, cuteness over cleverness.
Yes.
I mean, people are so attracted to other human faces. I don't mean like sexually romantically attracted. It's just our eyes scan each other's faces when we're together and we're not even conscious of it. And that's why people remember faces but not names. And this is all about connecting soul to soul, I think, to use more spiritual language, spirit to spirit. All through the eyes. It's all through all the messages that are being sent around the lower face, which makes the mask wearing so off-putting to a lot of people, because you can't get as much emotion just looking here as you can get looking at the whole face.
There's some concern with children having to wear masks all the time and not getting that feedback right now.
But I'll tell you, my, let's see, he was born in January, so 9-month-old grandson will look at you and giggle and engage even when you have a mask on, because he's learned to look just here to take in that information, and
That's amazing.
he will respond. It's pretty wild.
What do when you just take the masks off?
Yeah.
I think the reason that being together and seeing each other face to face is so important for human beings is because, or it might be because it affirms our own humanness. We are connected, we belong, we are part of this species.
Right.
We're part of this tribe. And that does make you stop, maybe before you call someone an idiot, because you will realize that misbehavior will you might get you voted off the island. And human beings just crave togetherness and connection. And even the most, I think, brusque, sort of most independent looking person still needs to connect. Even introverts need community, companionship, connection. They just don't need it 24/7 like us extroverts. But apparently that's our superpower, is the spirit. I think I would call it a spiritual trait, characteristic.
And it helped us survive the Ice Age.
Although he does talk about this idea of our fatal flaw with regard to the affinity or the need to connect and the friendliness is that we have more affinity towards our group than the group that we don't know.
Right, that's in that chapter 5, I think, again, where
He blames oxytocin for it.
Yes.
what
Which of course is, how babies bond with their mothers. And you know, I was thinking about that. How do all of those little, how do babies know their mothers? And it seems that they always do. Oxytocin is one of the hormones that provides that value, that a baby can somehow find its own mother across the, not just with humans, but across species. I'm thinking, you know, how do all those penguins come back from getting the fish or whatever they need to get and find their own mate and their own egg? I've never, that's such,
That's sound.
is it sound? Oh,
They make noises and that they can recognize each other, and they can
okay,
find
okay,
the nest
okay,
among hundreds or thousands of nests somehow.
okay. Well, then I'm getting us off the point. Oh, never mind.
But,
Thank
but penguins are not mammals, so we can go back to mammals, and I think you're right.
Dogs and cats can get separated over many miles from their homes and find their way back. And
Right, yes.
Jean's dog, my dog, I think everybody's dog, they just, the dogs just assume they're part of the family.
Mhm.
They, you know, we are their, not tribe's not the right word, their pack.
Pack.
Exactly, they are pack animals. Yeah.
We are a pack. Where we go, she goes, vice versa.
I heard something on the radio today or yesterday that said that dogs do not recognize our faces. They recognize us by our smell or sound.
So just getting back to what Jean
Yes.
said, while there's a value in the bonding, there's also a problem with the bonding. But towards the end of the chapter 5, I think he says, surprisingly, that at the end of the 20th century had fewer deaths by conflict than previous centuries. That was a real surprise.
Overall, those statistics that he uses to put things in context towards the end there, I thought were quite interesting and kind of mind blowing.
Yeah, you kind of wonder, how does he make sense of, you know, introducing the fact that civilization caused problems with his underlying thesis that down deep we are good. He ends chapter 5, page 112, by saying, so how sustainable is our civilized lifestyle? He says, civilization, is it a good idea? Too soon to say.
Mm-hmm.
Mhm.
So he doesn't draw a definitive statement, since we are in the midst of civilization, and there's a strong argument that can be made that we're not headed in the right direction right now. But I think maybe what he's saying is down deep, we have the resources
Yes.
to care for ourselves and for one another and for everything, the planet, our civil society.
Right, but some of the things that divide us, I think he talks about those as the, money, taxes, property, that's what really started to divide, or came with the birth of the state. And when you think about this idea of the 99 and the 1%, going to what he says there at the end of chapter 5, that 3/4 of the global population lived in bondage to the wealthy. Well, is 99% of the global population living in bondage to the wealthy now? How is that going to play out if we can't use some of this intrinsic, to your point, Jeffrey, some of this intrinsic goodness to share?
Well, that's why his book may be revolutionary, because I think there's a lot of political ideologies left and right, but I think, here's my bias, I think it's mostly on the right, that tend to say you need to have a heavy hand to keep people in their place. It's on the left too, but, and it's the heavy hand of the state then that gets wound up or bound to the powers of commerce and business and religion. And it can become very unholy and very unhealthy for the thriving of the planet. So maybe his book needs to be read by everybody who has a little authority, which is everybody. We all have a voice. We all have a vote and a say. it really upends the whole enterprise of religion, his book.
Oh, yes.
Or you could be viewed that way.
It was starting. That's kind of started this idea of, yeah.
I'm wondering in the last 200 pages if you'll take it to that logical conclusion, but basically religion exists to solve, to fix people. Well, if people don't need to be fixed, then I'm not sure you need religion.
One of the things I thought was interesting is that talking about the paternalism of the church over hundreds of years, and how they said the church, because people were serfs and they were under the thumb of the king or whoever it was, they needed a religion that would say, in another life, things will get better.
Mm-hmm,
He mentions that too.
mm-hmm,
The modern nation state is only 200 or 300 years old. This idea that there are fixed borders, little boxes,
mm-hmm.
and that there's this idea of sovereignty within each of those boxes. That's a fairly new idea. I mean, the borders in Europe were very fluid. In Africa, there were essentially no borders until the 1860s, when Africa was carved up by the colonial powers.
Mm-hmm.
Germany was not a unified state until the 19th century, as well as Italy. This idea of a powerful central government is fairly new. In the ancient kingdoms, like Mesopotamia and Persia and Greece and Rome, you had a strong central government, but it was very fuzzy around the edges, like who's in, who's out. Rome didn't even make it all the way to Ireland. So Ireland was always this little wild area. Thankfully, still is. And so this idea of absolute sovereignty within nation states is pretty new. And when you say this is our country, all kinds of problems can develop from that, because it's I don't know if you've heard this phrase, America first, but there's always been an America first aspect to our national identity, and it can lead to war, unhappy trade relationships with other countries,
Mm-hmm.
et
And
cetera.
that's about resources, right? It's about resources and making sure, leading resources, that kind of thing. Had you guys heard this bit about soldiers and how much only 13 to 18% fired their guns?
Yes, that was
I hadn't heard that.
fascinating. It really made me feel good in a way.
Yeah,
But who
but
was-
I had never heard that. Never.
Mm-mm.
That hasn't made it to the BBC yet, so that was new for me.
Jeffrey, I wonder, this guy lives in Holland. I wonder if he heard those BBC stories and incorporated them into his book.
Maybe anything's possible. Yeah,
Oh, I was thinking the opposite, that BBC got it from him.
yeah,
Maybe
maybe.
so, yeah.
Yeah, so the soldiers who wouldn't shoot, that's the title of chapter 4.
Yeah.
Imagine if the US military started to read this book, I mean, or any military, it kind of makes you wonder, well, what do we have to do to motivate our soldiers to fight? And I have heard this theory before, that you have to kind of dehumanize your enemy to get members of your armed forces to actually pull the trigger. So
There's a story in my family when my mother's brother was in France during the Second War. And so the army is out going through a village where I guess some people are hiding, or they weren't sure if it had been vacated. And my uncle went into a building, I think it was a house, and came upon a German soldier, and the two men looked at each other eye to eye and walked away from each other. So the lesson to me is that when you look at what you believe is your enemy in the eye, one-on-one, you're not really enemies. At some level, yeah.
And both were probably drafted by their governments
Right,
rather than this is a choice, who knows, you know.
yeah,
If people are forced to shoot, then we need to be much better about PTSD and other things after the war than we are right now, because that is not a human thing.
Yeah, when people do bad things during war, by bad, I mean just participate in atrocities along the everyday activities of warfare. And it's really against human nature to do that. This explains PTSD to a large extent.
Mhm.
And as a pastor, I have counseled World War II vets. I mean, there are fewer and fewer of them, but I have counseled World War II vets who, since 1945, have been carrying around images, personal involvement in atrocities, and they just needed somebody to talk to process it. Because it was not well appreciated at the end of World War II when soldiers came home and sailors, the whole idea of PTSD and the need for counseling and what it could do to your brain and your heart and your relationships with other people. So a lot of these guys came back from World War II and they had all those wounds, but they did not have, there was no way to process them.
Jeffrey, when I worked at the senior center, we interviewed many veterans in World War II, especially for the Library of Congress. And many of them said that they had never told their story before. And many of them broke down in the process. And afterwards said, this is just the best thing that could possibly happen. I can finally tell this story and I feel much better. It was amazing.
So
And there were some pretty horrible stories.
They were
War
really
story.
victims of a societal norm that said, we won, you know, we're going to go on. Let's just put that all away.
part of the dehumanizing of the enemy is to find clever names for them and dehumanizing names. Well, one is just to call them the enemy. That removes their nationality, their names, and so forth. Gooks and Japs and Krauts and all those terms. It probably still happens in warfare today in the Middle East and so forth. And then there's also warfare that's modern warfare. You don't actually see the face of your enemy. You're pulling the trigger.
Sometimes if somebody's pushing a computer button in North Dakota or something, and they're bombing somebody in Iraq,
or you're 30,000 feet above the ground.
yeah.
And this makes it easier, right? But there's a lot of patriotism too that gets drilled into members of the armed forces, so that whatever you're doing it for the greater good of God and glory and country, which again dehumanizes the enemy. And people talk about the service of veterans in terms of this is what they did for us, and they sacrificed themselves and so forth, which does not take into account what they did to others in the process of putting their lives on the line. It's half the story, it's not the full story.
Well, it goes back to what Rutger was saying about the oxytocin, right? You create greater love towards their group and then give them praise for doing that as well. Even if someone feels something about that, they're going to suppress it.
What else strikes you as?
That's a good connection, Jean. Oh, I was just going to say that early on, this was, I think, in connection with the reality shows. Some boys were put into a kind of isolated situation, and one of them said, well, we were getting along fine, and they had to induce some kind of problem for us to get riled up about. And it's kind of connected also, of course, with news media, but I just thought that was an interesting idea, that there's for someone's greater gain, there's a problem that is induced.
Mhm. Mhm.
Against my better judgment, I am forced to watch Big Brother on CBS. And it's so interesting. It's exactly that, Nancy. The producers of the show obviously create the rules in such a way
Mhm.
that people are going to be lying and cheating.
Yeah, they select for certain personality types as well.
Yeah, right. But each week somebody's voted out of the house, basically. And
Mhm.
last week there was a triple eviction. And not that I watch it. Okay, I do. But you can just tell that they're manipulating everybody, including the viewers.
Along with the news, that program and others, they take the worst part of humanity and celebrate it in a way.
Mhm.
I mean, you can't be successful in that show and be truthful. It's all about deception, about having multiple alliances throughout the house.
Mhm.
And the moment of truth comes when you have to vote against someone who's in your alliance. And
Yeah, well, they should draft them for the CIA following their completion of the.
Oh, I was just going to ask you, Pastor Jeffrey, how does that speak? How does that Big Brother show, which I don't think I've ever watched, how does that speak to this book?
Well, yeah, he does talk about the reality TV shows, and that if it was just a bunch of people living together in a house, there'd probably be enough drama to make it interesting, but they kind of have to force more drama by pitting people against each other, because that's how you get viewers, to make it interesting.
I think that was the point he was making about the Lord of the Flies, and that many of these shows, they would put the people together and there wasn't enough drama. So they had to instigate it, that it was coming out like the boys on the island. They were working out ways to get along rather than creating the drama that they wanted.
Yeah, and there's more of that in the next 100 pages about the Milgram experiment and some of the other experiments at Stanford and elsewhere. Yeah.
I'm interested to see as the book goes on, because some of the things I wrote down as I was reading this, and he's talking about the good of, people are more good than not. It made me think of, what's happening in Aleppo. Here's the city that's just, been under siege and is now in ruin, or what happened in Rwanda with the Hutus and the Tutsis. How then, are these things created, or do you rationalize, these things happening in society? So I'm interested to see where he goes.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I was interested in his comments about Augustine on page 17. We talked about it briefly already. Augustine's insight about original sin is a foundational Christian doctrinal building of Christianity, whether you're Catholic or Protestant or Orthodox for that matter. And if you take original sin out of Christianity, by the way, that phrase original sin, it's not found in the Bible. It is, you will find plenty of biblical material if you want to build a theology on that idea. However, that phrase is not in the Bible. The doctrine was developed, 5th century and so on. But if you take that doctrine out of Christianity, Christianity doesn't look like Christianity anymore. And in fact, when I was in seminary, I read a book by Matthew Fox that directly challenged original sin. It's called Original Blessing.
Not church as usual. Not church as usual.
Yeah, not church as usual. We're certainly there if we're questioning original sin. Here's a story for you. So I was in the first cohort of a spiritual spiritual direction program 3 years ago. And I was the only actually avowed Christian in the group. And there were several ex-Christians in the group. And one of them was pretty hostile and sort of angry about his experience in the church. And he said to me, so you're a Christian, do you believe all that, sin and salvation and all that stuff? And I said, well, I belong to the United Church of Christ and we're the most liberal of all the Protestant denominations. And he said, yeah, well, prove it. And I said, well, read our statement of faith. So I sent him our statement of faith and he read it and he said, okay, it says right here, we believe in Jesus, Lord and Savior. What is he saving us from? I can't be part of any religion that is trying to save me from anything. And obviously I've remembered this conversation. It made me question, yeah, we use this language of Jesus as Savior all the time. What if people are good?
Well, maybe though, the saving, like we're talking about here, is from the civilization, is from the state, is from, what is pulling us away from our innate goodness.
It's got to be spun that way. That's not what Augustine meant, nor is it what all those hymns meant.
Yeah, I never liked that idea, even as a child in the Catholic Church. And you're coming at you with this, you are a sinner, you're original. Now I would sit there in the pew and think, well, not really.
I worked with we had a leadership team. 5 of them were Catholic and I'm a Protestant. And they all kept talking about guilt. And I understand guilt, but man, did they talk about guilt. So you're talking about the Catholic Church. Maybe part of it, I don't know.
Well, original sin is foundational to Protestantism too.
Yeah.
It's just foundational to Christianity, traditional Christianity.
Well, I wasn't taught that as much either.
Yeah, you start out, you're bad.
I ignored it maybe.
You start out, you're bad.
But maybe we need to be saved from not having enough oxytocin and serotonin to go around to everyone.
In spiritual direction, I like to tell people, you don't have to bring a problem to me. You can just bring yourself. And because you're not a problem to be fixed or a problem to be solved, we can just talk about your spiritual life, how you encounter and experience the holy. If you have a problem you want to talk about, an intellectual issue or whatever, we can talk about that, but we can just enjoy the divine presence within each of us and in this holy moment and place together. It's like, really? That's spirituality too?
Beautiful, Jeffrey.
Good.
I wonder about that though, Jeffrey. That presupposes a divine something, right?
Yep.
So you'd have to also entertain that there could just be making meaning of whatever this is.
Right. That's why I use about 15 to 20 words
I know.
interchangeably for the one great love,
Yep.
the infinite consciousness and spirit and presence. I use all those before we get to God, because that's where people go right away to, I'm imperfect. I need salvation in that traditional sense. But, even in this spiritual direction world I live in, teachers will distinguish between the true self and the false self. Richard Rohr does. All teachers do eventually, even in Buddhism, which is barely a theological system at all. You will get a sense that there's a tendency in the human being to forget our divine nature.
Mm-hmm.
Now that's different than original sin that needs to be washed away by the blood of Jesus on the cross, or saying the right doctrinal words or whatever. But even Richard Rohr speaks of the true self versus the separate self. he doesn't use false self, he uses separate self. It's that part of us that tends to pull away from our sense of belonging, connection, and responsibility to the divine nature in us, in others, and in life itself. So could that be original sin with a different language?
I like the language better.
Yes, I do too. Absolutely. Jeffy, I'd like to know what happened with this fella who used to be a Christian and challenged you. Did he
Well,
ever come
we both-
around or?
Well, we both completed the program together, and I think he always kept an eye on me. I think he was afraid of, being proselytized, being, I don't know, told his thoughts were wrong, or that he wasn't really as spiritual as I am, or something. I don't know. So I've gone through my spiritual piece here. What else do you find worth remarking on?
I thought that his, this was around page 100 that, as he talked about how this all got started, the end of the Ice Age, the food and the warmth was more plentiful, in that area of Egypt. That caused people to settled life met greater distrust for strangers. People who were cosmopolitan became more xenophobic. And then also the proto-feminism died because women became a commodity to the settlements. And then the patriarchy was born. I thought, in that one, like 2 or 3 pages, this neat little, that caused me some, I had to go back and say, okay, what was that again? Let me read that one more time. Did that strike anyone else?
Oh, absolutely. And also the genesis of diseases comes from being domesticating animals. That was interesting too. Measles, other diseases, even sexually transmitted diseases. It's kind of okay here.
And that's where he talks about religions coming out as a means to answer the why are these things happening.
I didn't quite get that. Maybe you've read further than I have, or maybe I just missed that.
Well, he talks about the birth of religions as a way to explain the calamities that were going on around them, and that they started to worship idols and, say we must be doing something wrong, so we'll try this. Let's throw some humans on a pyre, see how that works out.
And that's very much a part of the Old Testament too.
Mm-hmm.
We must be doing something wrong. So, or it's that God is telling them they're doing something wrong.
Mm-hmm.
But earlier it was
Where I'm going here. Excuse me, Junia.
Earlier it was the gods. I'm taking a sort of a class on ancient Mesopotamia, and they were just talking today about the huge temples that they built, and nobody lived there. There's just a statue of the god, and the god had to be fed and given water and so forth. Who knows how that happened? But the god was, if the things were going well, the god was happy. But as you said, Jean, if things were not going well, the god was angry. And there were different levels of gods, and then gradually that moved. I mean, this is 4,000 or 5,000 years ago, but gradually we got, Jeffrey, it'd be interesting to know how we eventually got to the idea of one God.
It's a development, exactly as you're suggesting.
Yeah.
Even in Africa, people still spoke about local deities, but people said, well, but there is really just one overall deity. This idea of monotheism parallels the increasing centralization of political, cultural authority. And the Old Testament does have plenty of examples of a world before monotheism, though. In fact, Genesis speaks of God in the plural. We've created. And then I found out recently that so does the Quran. The Quran speaks of God as in plural, often, which is fascinating because if there's one core concept of Islam, it's the unity of God and the one, that there is one God and only one God. Likewise, Judaism. And then Christianity, again, is not quite as monotheistic as
Because we have the Trinity, right?
because we have this one, but we also have this three. And so
But they're connected.
but they're connected
Right.
somehow, mysteriously. Yeah, it's a development. Yeah, in Shona culture in Zimbabwe, people spoke about God in many different words, but there was one word, Mwari, that referred to the God that was in a cave in one place in Zimbabwe. And everybody said, well, that's really the overarching God, but there's also all these other spirits and gods all around. So I think there's a tension between monotheism and polytheism that's still with us. But the gradual tendency, especially of the major religions, is to say there's one God.
Mhm.
Just like there's one king, there's one global order, there's one McDonald's, there's one Google.
Hmm.